everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm delighted to be kicking off on a very interesting webinar topic, one that continues to intrigue me as somebody who is engaged in helping schools increase their enrollment, but also very interested in implementation success. So we're going to be talking about if you want to increase enrollment, what do you need to do organizationally to structure your enrollment management department and folks around the achievement of some key outcomes that are imperatives in the world we live in. So I'm delighted to be joined today by two very distinguished enrollment and management professionals and consultants and counselors to many other schools. Inez Odom of La Jolla Country Day School. I'll introduce Inez more formally in a minute. And Jordy Mitchell, who is a leader at the Buckingham Browne and Nichols School. Again, a more formal introduction in a minute. So our topics today will include getting a level set together on what is the situation in enrollment that independent schools are facing today. What are the schools doing currently to address some of the challenges they face, and what more needs to be done based on the perspectives of our panelists. We'll also talk, as I mentioned earlier, about how well current organizational structures, job design, support systems, measurement systems, etc., support the new work that must occur in light of the challenges we face. And we'll talk about what our panelists recommend in terms of future looks at organizational structures, job design, the skills of the folks that engage in the work, and also the systems that support it. One of the things that we recognize is that those of you on the program come from a wide variety of school situations, large, small, medium-sized. So we'll try to be, in our comments, attentive to what are the nuances of difference that we need to think about related, for example, to smaller schools with fewer resources, et cetera. And in your ability to shoot in questions, feel free to add your own perspectives on some of these nuances as well. Measuring Success, which I'm proud to represent, has been helping independent schools since 2003. We're based in Washington, D.C., and our focus should try to be current with the needs of the field. Today are recruitment and retention, financial sustainability, and increasing satisfaction of all the constituencies in independent schools. As I said, I'm delighted to be introducing Jordy Mitchell and Inez Odom. Let me talk for a minute about Jordy. Jordy is an icon in the independent school enrollment management work. I can't even begin to enumerate all I've learned from him, and I've been privileged to work with Jordy on a number of programs, including consulting work in independent schools. Jordy was born and raised on St. Paul's School campus in Baltimore. He has worked at a number of distinguished schools, Trinity Pauling, Wilmington Friends, and more recently he is Director of Enrollment Management at Buckingham Browne and Nichols School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His entire family is engaged in education. Jordy is a founding board member for ASAP, has frequently presented at conferences and workshops, is on various important blue ribbon planning committees for NAIS, and is helping them chart the future. And we are delighted to have Jordy join us today. Inez Odom is a very distinguished and well-known assistant head of school for enrollment management and outreach at the La Jolla Country Day School. I think Inez's bio says an incredible amount about her thoughtfulness, her insights into people and organizations. She's created a personal philosophy statement. She believes that in life, people are either participants or observers. She's a participant. And when she sometimes wonders if she'll have the time, strength, energy, follow through, initiative, will, spirit, or ability to continue, she calls upon her recognition that everything that has ever been achieved has been done by people like Inez herself. Rather than worrying about failing, she chooses to delight in the possibilities of success. And she is focused on meaningful relationships with people and uses those skill sets over the last decade at La Jolla Country Day School to help enroll children who through education have become leaders in their world. Much of her role involves determining, developing, implementing the strategic enrollment management initiatives for her school. She also is the creative director and genius behind the Roots and Wings podcast, which I've had the honor of both watching podcasts and also contributing one with Inez. She's the first point of contact for prospective applicants and their families, and is a graduate with a bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of New Hampshire and a master's degree in communications from Stanford University. And she cares deeply about the well-being of children and families. So can't think of any of more suitable participants to talk about some of the implementation challenges that the new proactive recruitment is causing to come to the fore and will be focused on. So thank you both for joining. The ideas that we're going to be talking about are not theoretical. They're based on real work in real schools all over the country. This is just a small sample of it. You want to get to know you, those of you who are on the program. So we're going to ask a series of 3 brief survey questions to kind of tabulate and give us a sense of kind of who's on the call. The first question: what has your school's enrollment trend been over the past 5 years? Pick your answer and respond, please. I see a good mixture. Looks like the largest percentages are either in the increased modestly, oh, that just jumped up, and second, the decreased modestly. Third is a state about the same, and then we have the 2 poles of decreased significantly and increased significantly. So overall, I think you have a positive trajectory. Let's go, Scott, to the next question. What is the state of your qualified inquiry pipeline? Okay, here the largest percentage, sufficient in some divisions and grades, but needs help in others. Next comes insufficient. We need a lot more. I think we'll be talking a bit about that one. And minority, but not insignificant, sufficient, but just barely. So this looks like an area of current need and interest. So that's, I think, on point with what we're going to be talking about. And then third question, Scott, if you could, how recently have you examined how well your enrollment management organizations design, skills, and systems support enrollment growth? Wow, big percentage doing this now. So it sounds like we're timely here. And hopefully we'll learn something from you as well as contribute some ideas. Doing this now, again, over 50% or about 50% within the last couple of years, planning to do it. Okay, so I think I'm glad we're talking about what we're talking about. It looks like it's apropos, so thank you for that. Before I kind of poll so we can take the polls down, Scott. Let's see. Okay, so measuring success is sense, and we are the managers of NBOA's biz data set and that sort of thing, is that based on the numbers, a third of the schools out there are experiencing enrollment growth and application growth. The bottom third are declining in both. And the middle third is kind of struggling to kind of stay even. One of the things I want to mention, because there are a good number of faith-based schools on the program, is that faith-based schools seem to be suffering enrollment declines a little bit more than the average or typical overall independent school. 45% in an analysis recently, again, of that NBOA data set declining over the last few years, a third growing, and just about a quarter are flat. So very timely topic. The other thing I want to mention, and then I want to call on Jordi and Inez to talk about their own experience and perspective. When we ask parents, very commonly, are they parents of independent school children, are you currently considering or have you recently considered other schools beyond ours for your children? About half say yes. So again, this suggests that the whole topic of re-recruitment and retention is important in the field. So let me turn things now over to Jordi and Inez. Let me start with Jordi. Jordi, what's your perspective based on what you see at your own school and also what you see in terms of the field on the dimension of what's the enrollment environment, what's driving it?
My school may be a bit of an outlier for some of the schools on the webinar, because Boston has been very fortunate to experience pretty solid and consistent demand for independent schools. However, that being said, that I do know that it's becoming a little bit more challenging in the early years. So that what I've learned from being here in Boston, but also working with a lot of schools around the country, is that it's impossible to generalize, because everybody's market is different. Every city is different. Even certain locations in a greater metropolitan area can be very different, depending on how good are the public schools that from your catchment area, what's the logistics for commuting and those kinds of things. So while my school is seeing very strong enrollment demand, we are the outlier, and even in Boston, there are some schools that have more of a challenge, and certainly around the country. So I think that when you are looking at your own situation, and there may be some boarding schools on the call, and if you are, you know that you're actually dealing in several different markets. But if you're a day school, I encourage you to pay much more attention to local demographics in the local market than to national norms and trends, because they could be completely irrelevant.
Right. I think you make a really important point, Jordi, and in fact, I know at La Jolla Country Day School, we're in Southern California, and certainly for us, there's no question that we, because we start with children as young as age 3 and go to grade 12 all on one campus, we know that for our lower school, we've put an enormous amount of focus and emphasis on trying to increase our lower school enrollment, recognizing that most lower schools in the nation are struggling to meet their enrollment goals, whereas certainly in terms of our middle and high school, we have been in a good position and continue to see a lot of interest. So we end up being a bit of a hybrid, where we're putting a lot of our emphasis on now the lower school environment and making sure that we're meeting those goals.
Let me ask you both the following. Thank you both for those statements. You know, based on our little poll, it seems like the majority of the schools on the call, on the webinar, could use a lot more qualified inquiries and prospects. Why do you think that's a particular need currently?
Inez, you want to start since I started last time? You ready?
I'd be happy to start. I mean, we were fortunate enough to work with Measuring Success in recognizing that we wanted to be very targeted, that we recognized that at the end of the day, there are a lot of marketing strategies that you can employ, but what you want to really do is be able to identify in a thoughtful and I think very systematic way where your market is, even within your community. And so rather than creating a shotgun approach, we were able to partner with Measuring Success and be much more thoughtful and tactical in our approach, as well as, I think, really having an opportunity to step back and make sure that we were being strategic in our partnerships. As a good example, we partnered with the new Children's Museum here in San Diego, and that has proven to be a very, very smart tactic for us in terms of identifying families that might otherwise not have known about us and being able to have the appropriate kind of exposure. So there is no question that it's absolutely a different world in terms of how we go about finding families that are mission appropriate.
Right,
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Harry.
No, please.
Oh, no, I was going to comment on the fact that the schools that I've been fortunate enough to work with, the comment that I hear almost 100% of the time is usually with a sigh is, we're tired of being the best kept secret. And so there are two aspects of this, looking for more robust inquiry pools. One is, what's your message? And I know this conversation is going to lead a little bit more into that. But the two pieces are, you've got to be really clear about your message and your value proposition, and then you've got to be really clear about your communication channels, of which we're going to talk about several. And the most exciting thing that I'm seeing in the enrollment space and Measuring Success is taking a lead in this, and that's not a plug, it's just the truth in my experience, is providing some really important data so that our schools and our enrollment offices can work smarter, not harder. And I know we're going to get to that in a couple minutes.
So just I would
just add to that I think the very exercise of looking at how you do business critically creates, you will find your own answers. And of course, anyone in an admission office anywhere, this is prime time right now. And so thinking about the idea of being quiet and reflective and may feel antithetical to where we are in our work process in this moment, but I will say that having the opportunity to think strategically and tactically, you have your own answers in some ways, yet the very exercise of going through it with a group like Measuring Success helps you find the best path.
All right, thank you both. Just really briefly, my own perspective is that the increased competition from kind of niche public schools, magnet schools, very focused, chartered schools, has eaten away at the relatively strong advantage and value proposition in the younger grades more than in the upper grades, because in the upper grades, I think people look at the return on investment in terms of getting into the right college and the right career as a better bet. So I think there's been a shift in terms of perceived value, and we will talk more about this, as you both mentioned, between the upper and lower schools. And I think the upper schools have the stronger suit right now, but need to be, wary of keeping their value proposition very, very present and in front of the consumer. Let me move now, since we know that there's a need for strengthening, inquiries and obviously enrollment, particularly in the lower grades. I want you to comment, please, on how are you seeing schools that you're aware of, your own included, respond to these challenges? How effective do you think they are being in terms of really confronting the root causes and the underlying issues? What more could and do they need to do to respond effectively? Because the work is changing, the need for change is apparent. How well are schools responding? Who'd like to start?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Please.
I'll
Inez.
start and just mention that I think the hallmark for any independent school is that you have a magnificent faculty, that your faculty really do define your school culture, and certainly bringing in the best possible faculty is always what will distinguish you. And so in many ways for us, when we were faced with how we were going to continue to sort of illustrate the value proposition, we did kindergarten exploration days as an example, where we were able to provide parents of prospective kindergartners and even parents who have younger children with the opportunity to be front and center with our faculty and see in up close and personal detail how we differentiate and what we do, and how what we do is unique to our school, and we were able to really illustrate the value proposition, I think, very thoughtfully. So the extent to which you can leverage creating master classes or opportunities to showcase your faculty, that's all to the good.
Great.
Frankly, most of the responses I'm seeing are a little bit knee-jerk from a lot of schools, and they involve doing more. They involve more fairs, more parlor meetings, more. And to me, that feels like a shotgun approach, and it has not been tremendously effective. These are high effort, relatively low yield events. And I don't encourage schools to do that, but I understand it. I know that when people in our role are feeling under the gun by our head of school or our board, we're very anxious to be able to say to them, yes, we understand, here's what we're doing in response. And we can add these things that we've added, but how effective are they really? In my experience is they're not tremendously effective. So that's most of what I see. And the effective responses, I think I was going to actually encourage Inez to talk a little bit more. I love the event that she talked about, showcasing the faculty, the space. But part of the piece of it is, how did you identify the people to invite to that? And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. But I think that being more targeted and intentional just in general, as opposed to this shotgun approach, the old school, we're going to have an open house and advertise and hope somebody comes. That's just not effective, and we're stuck in that because it's been our history.
Right.
I want to actually build on that, if I can, just for a minute. Inez, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, take it away, Harry.
So this is where, they say this, the best way to get from A to B is a straight line. And one of the things that Jordy is talking about, which is kind of sticking to the old ways of marketing a school and shotgunning, is where I think schools are kind of missing out, because the reality is, and in fact, we could learn a lot from the advancement department. The heart of the matter, since we don't have enough qualified inquirers, would be to figure out what's the best strategy for us to identify the most qualified inquirers for our school, not for a school in general. And one of the, I'll call it depressing things that I see when I go to conferences, for enrollment management conferences, is the virtual seeding of the who do I target and how do I target the right people for right families and students for my school, is the seeding of that to Google and Facebook, in terms of basically pouring more money and more thought into, okay, how do I game the Google and Facebook system so that they find my customers for me? And I believe that this is ultimately not a sustainable issue for a few reasons. Number one, and this the lower wheel talks about this, there are statistical and demographic tools available to every school now to target the specific prospects in an area by name, by address, by email, etc., using statistical analysis tools that tell every school what are its top 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 prospects based on a lookalike perspective, meaning I capture the profile of my school, I know what differentiates my profile from every other school, and I find families like those in my area. And that's an instantaneous prospect list. So that's something that isn't being done, but is a short path to the right prospect list. The second is taking fuller advantage of word of mouth marketing. We all know, and unfortunately now we see it in the disease world, that there's contagion, right? People talk to people either from a disease standpoint or a word of mouth advocacy for a school. Most schools are not taking advantage of the fact that we're all part of social networks. And if we can identify those social networks that capture the kind of families that we want and treat them as groups of people and cohorts, market segments is the term I use, but social networks is probably more understandable, and then work on increasing our mastery of those networks, we're missing out. But schools are kind of bypassing this. As I said, they're broadcasting, as Jordy said, to the world, hoping that Google and Facebook will find them the right customers. And there are two quick pathways to fixing that, the lookalike analysis and the market segment analysis. And then one of the other things that, relative to value proposition, that I think is underused is market research. Because the truth is, when you've identified who your prime prospects are, you can then do this profound thing of finding out what would have to be true for them to pick your school. You can't do that, though, if you're letting Google and Facebook find your prospects for you, because you only know them when they respond to something. So this double factor, so to speak, of more data-driven customer definition, market segmentation, doing the research, basically hands you on a platter what your value proposition has to be and what evidence you have to provide. And then the third wheel is creating pathways to these customers. Unfortunately, this is not happening in most places. What is happening, as Jordy said, and this is our finding, is more of the same, but pouring on the coals. And one of my favorite enrollment managers, who may be on this call, Julie Hellman of St. Mary's Hall, basically said it so well to me. I can't work any harder. I'm pushing as hard as I can on all the stuff I always do and working 24/7. I need to work smarter. And so this is the new work, and I'd like to hear Jordy and Inez talk about whether they think that's the reality, but many schools aren't doing it. Thoughts?
Well, I don't think they are. I think we've established that most schools aren't. Some have gotten a little bit more intentional. And I also did want to point out that this approach, because there are some schools on the call, I believe, or on the webinar, who sound like they have pretty solid enrollment. So what we're talking about, and we're going to continue to talk about, the point I want to make is it's one way to identify prospects if you need them to meet your enrollment targets. But for schools that are in a slightly better place, we almost always have compositional goals that we struggle with. It can be diversity, socioeconomic, racial diversity. Maybe you need more musicians or athletes if you're an upper school. These are all market segments that can be defined. You can identify them both with internally, and that's where your ambassadors come from, and then you can start to work externally through them to begin with, and then if you take it to the next step, you can do some lookalike modeling. But what we're talking about doesn't really exist in a consistent basis, and I think part of that's just because we're not familiar with this as schools and as a profession. It's still a relatively new concept.
And absolutely, I think Jordy is spot on. The other aspect of that is really recognizing that re-recruitment or retention is the lifeblood of what we do as well, and using some of these mechanisms to help you with your re-recruitment is the next level of tactical thinking, so that as you, for instance, have a group that already exists within the school and people are identifying as part of it, whether it's a neighborhood-based group or it's a group based around athletics or the arts or academic league or whatever the case may be, and ways in which parents then have come together around that to have tactical ways to reinforce those relationships and then to market to those groups so that as things develop, as things progress, people continue to feel a sense of community and identification. All of that helps you with your value proposition, that families feel that you've solved their problem. That schools are being hired for to solve a certain problem for a family or to meet a need for a family. And how do we, as enrollment managers, make sure that we're creating that connectivity so that not only the student continues to have a great experience, but we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about or think about how parents continue to feel connected and that we are being thoughtful about parents in terms of their schedules, their work schedules, and their desire to feel connected to the lives of their children and their children's life within their independent schools.
I think that's well said, Inez. What I would, the perspective I would add to what you've said, and again, this is based on my experience with a lot of schools, is we know so little often about our families. It constantly astonishes me that schools are surprised to learn that at any point in time, half of their families are considering, should I go elsewhere? And I think a lot of this is because we haven't really defined clearly enough who our target customers are, what their social networks are, and done the research to understand not just how satisfied are they with what we're offering, but how do we compare constantly to what else is out there, whether that's the public school down the road, the magnet school, the charter school. So we're too inwardly focused. We skip the first two wheels and then we jump to the third and start putting stuff out there, but we know so little. And I think the approach that I think the three of us are talking about is the need, whether it's because you're in the 2/3 of school that don't have enough students or the third that wants to diversify consciously its students, as Jordy mentioned, we need to be more precise about who we're targeting, know more about them, and craft our messaging and our value to what they're insisting on. So this is work that many schools aren't currently doing. Now the question I have for Jordy and for Inez is, what do we do about that? Right. And I put together this little picture here to kind of describe this situation. Let me throw it out there and see if you think it makes sense. So, we're seeing 5, and it's simplistic, but for a purpose. So there's 5 groups of things on here from the bottom up, right? Pipeline management. We're all really good at that. We focus on inquiries, taking those inquiries forward through to matriculation, et cetera. We're doing tuition assistance. We're really focused on those things, managing the pipeline, but we don't have enough inquiries. So we've just talked about 3 new things that have to happen to make sure we have enough inquiries, right? We need to be better at targeting prospects and have a playbook for how to attract them, right? We have to be better at value proposition messaging. And then we have to be able to target powerfully those messages through social media and social interactions and ambassadorship. But the top 3 are underdeveloped. So what does a school do, right, in this situation if it wants to move to this, right, and recognize that social networks dominate, but we're not consciously understanding them or researching them? What do we do about it? So let me kind of put that up in the form of the following questions.
I want to add something really quickly to this context, maybe to help some other people think about it slightly differently, but I think equally as well. For those of you that aren't familiar with the now late, unfortunately, great Clayton Christensen, who wrote a book called Competing Against Luck. NBOA, the Business Managers Association, and NAIS have talked a lot about his concept of jobs to be done and or needs to be met by the product. And I wanted to include that that wording because sometimes in schools that's easier to grasp. That makes more sense to some people that we work with than some of the other wording. And each of these different market segments or social networks that we're working to attract are probably having different priorities for the jobs that they're hiring us to do. And that's the research you need to understand is what job are they hiring us to do and what's job one they're hiring us to do, and then how do we create our value proposition for that particular segment, because it is not a one-size-fits-all process.
And I want to just add to that, Jordy, that for us, one of the things that we realized was that there's no question that every year you have to be thinking about remarketing to your constituency, even your happy constituency, because they may or may not know some of the wonderful things that you've done, that you're developing, that you're iterating. One tactical way in which we were able to do this was we did something called coffee carts and conferences, and we tried to look at what are those organic moments when parents are going to be on campus and having those parents being met by leadership. So you're coming on campus for your child's, quarterly review with the faculty member. Rather than sort of waving to you as you walk by, we very consciously use that as a moment to plant ourselves as a leadership team, to speak with parents and to really glean what is it that you need from us? How are we doing? Taking sort of an informal poll, but finding out what are the pain points for parents? What are the aspects where they're very happy with what they're getting? And so I think you're 100% right that we have to consistently, we can't assume we know what is it that they're hiring us to do, that we continue to be active in engaging in that dialogue with them.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And then again, add the perspective that the environment is constantly changing too, right? I came up with a way to explain enrollment or disenrollment, right? It's a math equation, right? The numerator of the equation, I hope I'm not putting anybody to sleep here. I'm not, by the way, I'm not a math person, but I think for me this works, right? Jordy is smiling. So the numerator is what people want from us, in terms of school choice, minus our tuition. And the denominator is what they want minus the competitor's tuition, right? So if you think about it that way, when you move into deficit position in that ratio, meaning, a new competitor opens up, or another school is upping its value or changing its tuition structure relative to yours, you got to be sensitive to the fact that the equation in the mind of your parents is constantly being evaluated, because we charge a lot of money by and large, right? So they're being prudent and constantly saying, okay, is it still worth it? Is the value proposition compelling relative to everything else I can get? Or if they're new families, right? How does the value proposition in terms of what I care about minus tuition at school X compare to what I could get elsewhere? That research and that being out there often doesn't have a home in the admission or enrollment management department. That definition of what target segments strategically we're best off pursuing and what lookalike individuals are most like our current families and how do we find them and identify them, that work's not happening. So my question now for Jordy and Inez is, how well do the current organizational structures and job designs and skill levels and support systems and belief systems in our schools promote acquiring those things that are currently missing and mastering them? What's working for it? What's working against it? And what advice would you give to school leaders if they want more of the things that are missing but are starting from the organizations we live in? Tough question.
Jordy?
So,
Well,
you're up to it.
I don't want to always go first, but I'm happy to talk about that a little bit. Many of the schools that I know, colleagues that I've worked with, and even in my own institution, I'm looking at sort of question one, current organizational structures and job designs. The interesting history of admissions is that most of us got tapped. Very few people grow up saying, I want to be an admission director. Most of us got tapped because we get along well with others and we're pleasant and we're reasonably articulate. And we know our school and we can be passionate about our school. And in the last 10 to 15 years, the skill set that's necessary has changed. And now we're all directors of communications and we're social media marketers and we're being asked to collect and analyze data and understand research. And not only did most of us not get into this position with that skill set, but if it exists in our schools, it doesn't fall under our purview. So for many schools, in my experience, I'll just use it for instance, the communications office falls under development or external relations. And the admissions people have to sort of jockey for position to get their attention. Yet, for most of us, tuitions are probably 80% or greater of tuition revenue. So the organizational structure which we've inherited, I think is well behind what is necessary for these efforts that we're talking about to have the resources that they need.
Right. And what I would add to that is, you know, I certainly know that my introduction to La Jolla Country Day School was that I had my own multimedia production company. That was, and I was ultimately hired to work in admissions, but came from having worked with clients, et cetera. So I had a different lens through which I approached the world of admission. But what's interesting is actually the marketing and communications department here at La Jolla Country Day School, they do report to me. So that structurally has worked well. One of where I wanted to
was that always the case?
Always the case.
It was, okay.
Yeah, always the case. I mean, interesting, my predecessor also oversaw public relations, was part of his title, et cetera, but we then sort of splintered and created a separate marketing and communications department, and this role has overseen that department. And but what I wanted to sort of respond to was the notion of what might solutions look like for organizations of varying sizes, because as we know, the money rules the day in terms of how, and resources, and how we can do things. And so a couple of ideas would include things like tapping your local university and finding interns who are studying communications, whether they're, and having those interns, we've been very tactical and successful where our director of marketing and communications has had a fairly wonderful, steady stream of interns who have come. And what's valuable about that is that they are obviously fresh from the pool, and they're also really have their pulse on social media and are able to give us ideas about some of the best ways to maximize the changes in social media that seem to be happening hourly, right? You know, to keep up with all the new iterations. That's been a very valuable thing, as well as your local PBS station. I'm always encouraging independent schools to establish a relationship with your local PBS station for a number of reasons, because often they will have, because they're nonprofit, they will have interns or people who are willing to partner with an independent school in a more a less expensive way, and they become a way in which you can get resources that might be a value add. So partnering with your local universities, partnering with your local PBS station are all ways to help kind of crack this nut, because I think we now, as we start looking at restructuring, we're really thinking about how do you have someone whose job is to look at retention and re-recruitment? How do you have someone whose job is to really look at external prospects and how we bring in families in a much more targeted way. And then you have someone who, for lack of a better term, I would call care and feeding, right? That ultimately when families come to your campus, you want them to have an amazing experience. So what does that look like? And how do we continue to up the game so that a family feels like they're being treated very well and that they're getting what they need?
So I want to build on this conversation by putting out there some thinking, which I invite you to throw rocks at, in terms of, you know, if I had 3 FTEs to put into an enrollment management or an admission department, given the needs that become apparent on this call and based on the national data, there are 3 big job buckets that occur to me that have to be filled, right? And a lot of this work is different than the historical work because it assumes we don't have a sufficient inquiry pool or a sufficient view of the marketplace. So here's my cut at the 3 big jobs that aren't currently happening the way they need to. The first is to, Inez, this builds on your recent point, defining who our prime prospects are for us as a school, not just a bunch of rich people and where are the people who can pay tuition, but who are our prospects given who we are and what our strengths are. And those are market segments and they're also individuals. And then developing a playbook for how to capture them. To me, that's a job, right? Maybe it's not a person, but it has to happen, because if it doesn't happen, we're flying blind. We're going to give our life to Facebook and Google and hope they can find people for us. That doesn't make me feel warm and fuzzy in terms of assurance, right? I want to be in control. Then I move to managing the pipeline. This is something we do really well, right? You know, we do this great, so we keep doing that. But then on the other end, it's formalizing things like ambassadorship and tying it into our specific customers and our market segments more forcefully, and then doing something, Jordy, I think you were alluding to, which is tying in marketing communication so its measures are no longer, you know, hits and opens, but rather we're measuring marketing communications on inquiries and applications and matriculations, and we're all measuring them on the same things that we as admission people or enrollment managers or heads of school care about, right? Intrinsically, a hit on a website or an email open doesn't make my heart feel warm and fuzzy the way an inquiry would be, or an application or matriculation. So getting that in sort of under control, as Jordy, you were talking about, has to be part of the job. So this is my cut at those functions that need to happen aren't necessarily happening. Thoughts on this?
Well, I'll actually jump in because this is very relevant for us at La Jolla Country Day School. I wanted to make one additional point from the previous thought that I was sharing, which is also nowadays, if your admissions professionals are not getting solid professional development, you must invest in that. And even nowadays, there are online courses in, you know, basic business courses or things that will help them have some of the vocabulary that might be needed to understand ROI, et cetera, you know, so that, again, people can't, it's just, it's not the days of yesteryear. It takes a more sophisticated approach to what is a multi-million-dollar business depending on the size of your school. With that said, the 3-person department, the other thing I'll say about this is that ultimately, if you're going to staff anyone, and I think Jordy alluded to this, please staff admissions, because at the end of the day, we're bringing in the revenue. This is where the money comes in. And so making sure that you're staffing this well and absolutely being tactical and leveraging volunteers and people who can help is important, but this is not the place to have short shrift, so to speak. The other thing, and Harry, as you were talking about these 3 buckets, I think this is brilliant. I love this. I think we cannot overlook the center bucket, the managing the enrollment pipeline, because as much as we sort of, the other two are the areas that we haven't developed historically as well, the central bucket has to have people who know how to get out a re-enrollment agreement on time and how to do all of the trains have to keep running. So that, and so I just don't want it to be forgotten that that's such an important part of what we do.
You know,
in fact,
yeah,
in fact, the most efficient, right? If you've been successful in these other areas that we're talking about becoming better in, once you become more successful at that, then again, back to our development colleagues, our external relations colleagues, who talk about moves management, right there, and which is their strategy to move somebody from being interested to being a donor. Well, make sure that your enrollment management pipeline, you've got a moves management strategy to get people from an inquiry to your campus, to an application, to enrolling, and that you know what your strategy is all along. So we don't want to forget that. The other thing I wanted to add quickly, I just wanted to reinforce that staffing your admissions office well is both resources and then, to follow up on what Inez said, the right people with the right training, right? Just throwing FTEs at your admissions enrollment department, if they don't have the proper training, isn't going to move the needle for you. So it's a combination of the right people with the right training and the right resources.
Great.
And
I want to just mention,
I want to just follow up on what Jordy just said about moves management, because literally this morning I was walking out to go work with some students, and our PA president stopped me to say that she had been hearing from some of our newly enrolled families that they were feeling that once they became members of the community and school started, that they weren't feeling connected anymore, that there was sort of a stopping point to the connectivity. And I think that's the sort of feedback, and that's where you could have within your enrollment management office, your retention person is working tactically to make sure that that's never the reality. Yet for the traditional model, we're on to the next season, so to speak. So how do we make sure all of these things are being managed so much more tactically?
Right, and that middle bucket, you know, needs to keep its eye on re-enrollment and re-recruitment. So we could speak for hours about this. I just want to recap, and I want to thank Jordy and Inez very much. And again, maybe if there's interested, we could do more of this. If anybody's interested in real job descriptions behind any of these, please be in touch with me, because I have some prototypical job descriptions I'd be delighted to share with you and get your feedback on. But let me recap the road we've come. One, we've defined the needs, right? The needs for more qualified, appropriate inquiries, and also for the value proposition information and for the more targeted outreach, right, that will ensure that we're proactively in control of who we're targeting and why, what they need to believe about us, and what evidence is required. And we have an efficient merger of ambassadorship and marketing communication to reach those people. Often in our organizations, they weren't structured to do this. They were structured to manage throughput, assuming enough inquiries were out there, enough interest was there. So we have to retool, we have to redesign. Our current organization structures, again, promote the current way of doing business, and in some cases are seeding some of the things we need to do internally to Google and Facebook, et cetera. We need to recapture that if we're going to control our destiny. And so this is hopefully has been helpful to you. I want to see us take some questions. And I know, speaking for Jordy and Inez, we welcome if we don't hit your question and answer during this program. We're going to send you outreach information so you can contact us, and I hope you will, so we can continue this conversation, which again could go on for hours, but hopefully has been helpful to you as it currently stands. Scott, are there questions that have been posed that you'd like to feed to us in our remaining minutes?
Yeah, so there's one great question that Jordy actually already answered by text, but I'm not sure the rest of the audience ever saw that, and I think it bears repeating and reiterating. So the question was in reference to a point Harry made about reclaiming prospect targeting from Facebook. We were asked, how does the school spread the word better if not through social media and parent ambassadors?
Through not with social media and parent ambassadors? Again, the question is, who are we targeting, right? Market segments are groups of people, social networks that we need to be targeting with our ambassadorship and our marketing outreach. Right now, most schools have not defined where those target segments are and don't manage them as segments. They haven't sized them. They don't have lists of their members. They don't plug ambassadorship into those segments. Ambassadors are often picked because they have good personalities and love the school. They may not relate at all to those market segments. So ambassadorship applied to market segmentation is an underdeveloped, critical enabler of proactive enrollment growth. The most successful schools I've seen know their market segments and they cater to them and they do research among them. That's not happening in most schools. And ambassadorship floats off to the side. We may use ambassadors to do tours or to help out on tours. They very rarely are picked because they are consciously going to help us get the word out from a contagion standpoint in a market segment. Social media is not targeting well-known lookalikes for our school. It's targeting wealthy people out there with nebulous characteristics. We should be targeting the lookalikes for our school. So we're doing some good things, but we're not doing them with the intelligence and the data and the research that we could be doing them. And I think we're talking about putting it all together in a process. Define your prime prospects, define the messaging they have to hear, put the pipeline together, and then mobilize ambassadorship and market communication so it directly hits those particular prospects. This is a new paradigm for many schools. I hope I've answered the question. I'm not sure what Jordy wrote. I'm sure it was more succinct.
No, well, it was, fortunately, we were very much in alignment, Harry.
Oh, shoot, I was worried about that, Jordy. Any other questions, Scott?
Yeah, so we have a question about someone with a one-person department, and they're starting to think about adding a second person to the department. With the recognition that a three-person department is ideal, what would it look like for a two-person department, which you already have handy?
So here is a two-person version. that first person is still defining the prospects and the playbook, but also monitoring the success of what we're doing against those targets. So literally, if you have a lookalike prospect list, you can determine whether you are getting them, specific people, to inquire, to visit, right, to apply. That first person is managing that whole customer interface part of it. Then there's the inquiry through matriculation and re-recruitment process. That's the managing of pipeline, and also cultivating and supporting ambassadors. That's the second person in this department. Then we do need somebody to manage the marketing communication, and that's often done using contractors or outside resources. So here's a picture, and as you've got something to say about this comment.
No, I'm nodding. I mean, there's no question. I think that the thing I would say too is that the contractor for marketing communication, absolutely, I think that's invaluable, and that ultimately you want to, as you're looking at your budget, and I would argue that you want to make sure that that person is almost a 12-month person, in that you're going to want to use a lot of your summer months, depending on your enrollment, as a lot of planning time, so that just to be thinking practically again about how you use that contractor's time. Make sure you're using it during peak times when you can either be developing ideas or when you really need the help.
Right, but I would argue that if that first person defining prime prospects and what's required to acquire them does their job well, then the contractor for marketing communication is going to plug right into that, because then they're going to be measured, right, their success on whether they're filling the pipeline and reaching the right people. We don't rely on contractors to know that. They're not going to know our customers the way we know them or should know them, but they can plug into a known quantity of, here's the messaging you need to deliver to exactly this lookalike list or exactly these market segments. And then we can find good implementers on the contractual side. So I want to thank everybody, but particularly Inez and Jordy, for sharing their wisdom and experience with us all. And I can't think of more appropriate people to kind of help explicate this really big issue with us at Measuring Success. So we really can't thank you enough. I want to thank those of you who are on the other side of the screen for participating, and really invite you to be in touch if you're interested in those job descriptions, or if you'd like to share any additional questions. I know, speaking for myself and I think for Jordy and Inez, based on how much they share, that we'd be delighted to help you in the future and also get your feedback on this program. Thank you very much, everybody. Wishing you great continued success in what you do, and hoping that this has been helpful in a small way. Thank you all very much.
Thanks for joining. Take care.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you so much, Inez and Jordy.